Armor stats may just be the true endgame of Destiny 2 the video game, but which stats actually matter? Is mobility as useless as everyone thinks it is? Or is resilience the best stat in the game? Or do stats even matter at all? In this video I'm going to be trying to offer you my perspective and prove to you why my opinion is set in stone gospel.
I am Paul Muad'Dib Atreides! Listen, Uncle!
If you haven't already watched my previous video, I would highly recommend you watch that first, as this video is somewhat a follow-up to that one. In that video I just explained how the armor system works as a whole for legendaries and exotics, and we also talked a bit about how to farm the best armor. So yeah, check that video out and come back here if you haven't done so already. Without wasting any more time, let's start with the class stats. Now I'm sure all of you know by now that each class has a stat linked to their class ability. The higher the stat, the lower the cooldown is for your class ability. For warlocks that's going to be recovery, titans it's resilience, and hunters it's mobility. So we just got to keep that in mind when it comes to deciding which stats are actually good and which ones are not for each activity you're doing. Starting with PvE, as I explained in the previous video, you definitely want 100 resilience at all times. This stat will give you a passive 30% damage increase all the time when you have 100. It's by far the most important stat in PvE as it boosts your survivability seemingly for free. So I would definitely prioritize this stat over any other, but it's not the end of the world if you go below that. You can stay at 80 or 90 and still do well. But if you're doing the high-end content like GMs or even master raids, I would definitely try and get the 100 resilience. Now for the next stat, depending on your build, you may want to spec into discipline or strength, or even the stat which is linked to your class ability. So what I mean by this is if you have a grenade spam build, obviously you would go into discipline. If you're looking to spam, let's say, a rift or a phoenix dive build and a grenade build, you would want to spec into recovery and discipline. That is fairly straightforward. So how do you actually distribute your stats? Obviously in an ideal world you would have 100 and 100 for each ability that you're trying to spam, but in practice that's not really viable, especially when a lot of the good fragments give so many negative stats. So I decided to look into the breakpoints of some of these stats. What I mean by that is if you're trying to spec into discipline and you're not sure which stat gives you the most bang for your buck, I guess you could say, that would be a breakpoint. So for example, 70 discipline is better than running 60 by far, but running 80 or 90 hardly changes anything. So that would mean 70 is the breakpoint. So I've done this for every single stat, and we're going to start with mobility for getting your dodge back on hunter. Now hunters do have a lot of different ways to get their dodge back instantly. I don't know too much about hunters and their PvE builds, but I do know that they can get some melee kills to get their dodge back instantly. So you may want to pass on specking into mobility so much in PvE, but if you don't have a way to instantly get it back and you want to spam your dodges, on D2 armor pick you can see that each tier takes off 2 seconds from the gambler's dodge and 1 second from the marksman dodge. This trend stops at tier 7. Tier 8 only takes off roughly 1 second off your dodge compared to the tier 7. So tier 7 seems to be the breakpoint. Therefore I'm going to conclude that you can either run 7 or 10. There's no point really running 8 or 9, you want 7 or 10. And if you can't hit 7, then it shouldn't matter too much what you run as long as you get it as high as you possibly can. For the other classes, mobility isn't actually as useless as you may think. Now I may sound crazy when I say this and you might think I'm a noob, but when my mobility is below 3, I can't really strafe fast enough to dodge the enemy attacks coming at me, and we are still talking about PvE here. I did a little experiment in a GM where I ran really low mobility, then I changed to a decently high mobility at around 50, and I could very much noticeably tell the difference between the stuff that I could dodge and the stuff that I couldn't. I feel like that's one main reason why the lightweight weapons feel so damn nice to everyone. They give you that 20 mobility which just makes you feel like you strafe so much faster, and also give you a sprint speed increase, so that's nice. But to be honest, mobility is not important at all and you are far better off specking into other stats. I just thought it was worth a mention. Now we've already talked about resilience, so we can move on to recovery. For all classes I found recovery to not be as important as it once was. If your build is good you don't really need much recovery to be honest, but it can be quite nice to have in certain scenarios. In terms of the health regen, the recovery breakpoint is around tier 7, so if you're not going to be running 10 you should run 7, and for warlocks it obviously might be good depending on your build. For the rift regen it also appears to be tier 7 as the breakpoint. Tier 8 might not be that worth it, but tier 10 is also good to run. But to be honest I wouldn't really prioritize recovery over something else like discipline or even strength depending on which build you got. 7 recovery should be more than enough. 8 or 9 wouldn't make much of a difference in terms of the rift regen or the health regeneration, and tier 10 is of course worth it if you can put the stats into it without sacrificing too much of the others. So for titan and hunter I wouldn't go past 7 at all, but for warlock you can run 10. Now for a lot of these stats I do reckon that tier 7 and tier 10 are the 2 breakpoints. That's the trend I'm seeing at least. But anyway, let's move on to the discipline and strength. I'm going to put them both under one umbrella because they are pretty much the exact same. Now there isn't really a breakpoint in either of these stats. It's sort of just the higher it is the better. So to be honest I would just go as high as you possibly can. Me personally, I always prioritize discipline or strength after resilience, and if you have a build which spams both grenades and melees, you're going to want to get both as high as you possibly can, and depending on which one you think is more potent, you should definitely spec into that one more. So for example, I had an Arc Warlock build where I'd spam all of my abilities, but I would spec more into Discipline because I do think the grenades are way more powerful than the Arc Warlock melee. But on another build, on my Solar Titan build, I would have a Consecration spam. In the build, I would also spam Healing Nades, but I would still spec more into Strength because I do think the Consecration was more integral to the build than the Healing Nades. In an ideal situation, you would go for 100 Resilience, 100 Discipline, and 100 Strength. But of course, some fragments and your armor pieces by themselves just won't allow you to do that. So just get the Discipline and the Strength as high as you can. Moving on to the Intellect. In my opinion, this is the most useless stat in the game.
But Mega, supers are OP and you can spam them with more intellect.
You are dead wrong.
No, the Intellect stat does not help you spam supers at all. The majority of his super gains comes from your weapon damage, orbs, and armor mods you might have like Hands-On or Ashes to Assets. There are also a lot of exotics which give you your super energy really quickly like Phoenix Protocol or Orpheus Rig. The Intellect stat only helps you get your super passively, so that means when you're not dealing damage, when you're not picking up orbs, when you're literally just walking or doing nothing. And please correct me if I'm wrong, that is no gameplay at all in Destiny 2, the video game, in PvE. That just never happens. So in my humble opinion, I do think Intellect is a wasted stat. If you really want to spam supers, you're going to put on an exotic which can do that for you, or you just put on Ashes to Assets or Hands-On. Do not spec into Intellect. If you want to, you are actively throwing I hate Intellect. However, in PvP, Intellect is bloody OP, so we can start with that for our PvP section. Intellect in PvP can be the tidebreaker in many Trials games. Unlike in PvE, you aren't shooting something all the time in PvP, especially in Trials and Comp. And that's where I believe Intellect to be the most important in the more competitive and slow-paced game modes. The breaking point for Intellect lies around 7 to 9. Tier 10 Intellect almost feels useless with just a 1% faster cooldown, but from the way it seems, Tier 9 seems to be the play, but you can definitely drop it down to 7 and not feel too penalized. Anything below 7 will just feel too low, and you probably won't get a single super in a Trials game. The Intellect stat also heavily depends on what super you're using. So if you didn't know, the supers are in 3 different tiers of cooldown, I guess you could say. I'm just going to call them tier 1, 2, and 3 to make it simple. The first tier is the quickest cooldown supers. So if you're at 100 resilience and you're not doing anything, you're just standing still, you're going to get your super in 5 minutes and 48 seconds. The supers in this tier are going to be Bubble, Silence and Squall, Shadow Shot, Deadfall, Blade Barrage, Well of Radiance, and Chaos Reach. So those are the quickest charging supers in the game. The next tier you're going to be looking at 6 minutes and 22 seconds. Those supers are Burning Maul, Twilight Arsenal, Storm's Edge, Mobius Quiver, Gathering Storm, Needle Storm, Nova Bomb, Cataclysm, and Vortex. And the last tier, tier 3, you're going to be looking at 7 minutes and 5 seconds. These ones are Fist of Havoc, Thunder Crash, Hammer of Soul, Sentinel Shield, Glacial Quake, Blade Fury, Silk Strike, Spectral Blades, both Golden Guns, Arc Staff, Song of Flame, Storm Trance, Winter's Wrath, Another Warp, and Daybreak. So if you want to pause the video or take a screenshot, that's all of the supers in their respective tiers. And when it comes to how much you should spec into Intellect depending on which tier your super's in, I think if you have a tier 1 super, you should definitely spec into 7 to 9 Intellect. There's no point really running 10 as I said earlier. If you're running a tier 2, I think you could run 7 to 9 Intellect. Even if you're not the one getting a lot of kills or doing a lot of damage in the Trials game, you will still likely get a tier 2 super, so I think it is worth specking into Intellect for those supers. However, if you're running a tier 3 super, I think it's a little bit different. If you typically aren't the one getting a lot of damage or kills, I wouldn't really bother specking into Intellect too much because the chances are you will not get your super at all. But if you often find yourself dealing the most damage, getting the most kills, whatever, you will probably get your super. So to summarize quickly, tier 1, spec into Intellect. Tier 2, you might as well spec into Intellect, but I wouldn't sacrifice too much of the other stats to do so. And tier 3, I would only spec into it if you often find yourself carrying. Right, so we can move on now. Now let's talk about resilience. In PvP, you get 2 main benefits from resilience. You get more health and more flinch resistance. I don't have any footage of the flinch resistance in practice, so you're really just gonna have to trust me when I say this. I've obviously played PvP for countless hours. I can safely say that tier 7 resilience is the breakpoint for warlocks and hunters. Obviously on Titan, you're gonna want to go for 100 resilience for the faster barricades or even the thruster ability if you use that. Tier 7 resilience is enough to survive 2 headshots and 1 body shot from a 120 hand cannon, but nowadays everyone does run precision instrument on the Igneous and the something new, and even some of them on the Criminal's Dagger. But there are other things in the game which you do survive at tier 7 resilience, one of them being the high impact frame pulses. Many people right now are using the LC's rifle and some of them are using messenger and stuff, and if you're running below 7 resilience, they can kill you in 5 headshots and 1 body shot. If you run 7 resilience, it requires 100% accuracy on their end, so that can definitely help you in gunfights. There are quite a few things you can survive at tier 7 resilience, so that's why I think it's the breakpoint. Obviously on Titans, you should just get it as high as you can. Next up, we're going to be talking about recovery. Same drill. On Warlocks, you want it as high as you can, but for Titans and Hunters, it can be a bit different. Health regen regen is extremely important as it determines how quick you can get back into a fight after taking damage or just peeking back in cover. If you are behind cover and you are low, someone will be rushing you to get the cleanup. So you want your health back as fast as you can. That's where recovery helps. A breakpoint in recovery is tier 5, but to be honest, that is super low. On any class, you should be trying for 10, but if you can't, because other stats are super important, it can be really hard to mid-max for recovery. So all of the breaking points for recovery would either be 5, 7, or 10. The difference between 7 and 9 isn't actually that high, so there isn't really much point in running 8 or 9, and tier 10 is noticeably faster than 9, so I would try for 10. If you can't do 10, do 7, and if 7's too high, you should go for 5. I wouldn't go below 5 at all in any game mode under any circumstance. Next up is discipline and strength. It's essentially the exact same story as for PvE. If you want to spam a certain ability, then you spec into a certain stat. I don't personally prioritize these stats over the other ones like recovery, resilience, or intellect, because I focus much more on gunplay than I do ability spam. That's just the way I enjoy the game. There are very niche cases where strength and discipline are actually really good to spec into, like for shoulder charge. A lot of people use that as a movement tool, but when you hit someone, you lose the entire charge. You want to get that back quickly for movement purposes, so I would spec into strength. So discipline and strength are pretty straightforward. There aren't really any breakpoints. We can swiftly move on to the most controversial stat in the game, mobility. No, mobility might not make you sprint faster, but it will get you laid. This I swear. Hunters should obviously be running high mobility, as high as you can in my opinion, just to get the dodge back quicker. But in the current meta we're in, it can be really hard to spec into mobility with resilience being as potent as it is. That being said, my armor on my hunter isn't actually that good, so I don't really run much resilience at all. That is whenever I do play hunter. I personally spec more into recovery and mobility, but I do know quite a lot of hunter players who do run 70 mobility so they can save stats for resilience and recovery. Honestly, I think Bungie should just change mobility to where it gives you more airborne effectiveness. I think that would at least make a few more people spec into it more, because right now it doesn't really seem worth it to the vast majority. And while they're at it, they might as well just make handling give more AE, because they did the same with stability and flinch resistance, so why not handling and airborne effectiveness, right? That way at least the hunters wouldn't be at such a disadvantage when it comes to armor stats. Anyway, with all that out of the way, let's talk about warlocks and titans. Many players, pros and noobs alike, they like to run very low mobility. Some people even run less than 30 in PvP. That's insane. On my warlock and titan, I like to run high mobility. I never really run anything lower than 60. The only reason I run 60 on my titan is because my armor just won't allow me to get really high resilience at the same time. But on my warlock, I can run 70 mobility and still have 100 recovery and 90 resilience. The benefits you get from mobility are strafe speed, jump height, and hopefully one day airborne effectiveness if Bungie are smart. One aspect of mobility that is really slept on is the strafe speed. It helps you duel opponents so much easier because you are moving so much faster. It just makes their life a lot harder to shoot you. For years I've been experimenting with the mobility stat. I used to run 60 all the time, but then when I moved on to 70, my aim literally got better. When I do aim, I do a lot of micro adjustments with my movement rather than my mouse. And honestly, it might just be because I'm used to 7 resilience, but whenever I run anything lower than 60, my aim just goes to shit. In my opinion, strafe speed is much more important than discipline or any strength that you can spec into, because you do use your gun more than you do your abilities, I hope. Another part of the mobility is the jump height, and I can understand why some people might not like it. You are in the air a lot longer when you do jump, and that can bottleneck you sometimes. And a lot of people make the argument that when you jump higher, you actually move slower in a straight line when you are doing stuff like strafing. But from my experience, the difference is so negligible that I wouldn't even bother thinking about it like that. You seriously just need to go through all the mobility tiers one by one and see which one works best for you. This is probably the most subjective stat in the game. Some of you are going to be fine with 50. I personally love 70. That is my sweet spot. So I'd recommend just experimenting. Right, that was a lot of info on armor, and I know all of this is pretty much just my opinion, but it is definitively correct if you think about it. Hopefully you guys got something out of this video, and hopefully you start considering running stats which you never thought you would. That should conclude my 2-part armor videos. Let me know if you're interested in seeing a video on how to get quadruple 100 stats. I can show you that if you want. I have got quite a few different combinations of quadruple 100 stats, not to flex, but I am flexing. Leave a like on the video if you did learn something. Subscribe if you want to see more informative PvP content. I can do some PvE content if you want. I just focus more on PvP. So just let me know down in the comments what you want to see, and I'll try my best to get it done. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it, and I hope to catch you in the next one. Bye bye now.